I'm just going to go ahead and lay it out there. North Carolina does it the best, and we are very amazing here in North Carolina. Sub Carolina, you're pretty good, but North Carolina rocks. This information right now in this video is going to be very specific to North Carolina real estate practice. If you're in another state though, keep listening and make sure that you can apply this information somewhat to where you operate. And if you're a consumer, you should absolutely stay tuned, because I'll give you some insights on what to be asking and watching for when you're interviewing real estate agents. So when the public goes to sell a house, they think, hey, I'm calling a real estate agent. And when you go to buy a house, you call an agent. And you don't really know that there are specific kinds of agents and specific roles that we perform, such as a seller's agent is under a listing agency agreement and a buyer's agent is under a buyer agency agreement. Then there are dual agents who can work for both parties. There's designated dual agents, which are the same firm, two agents. Then there's seller sub-agency, which big red, no, don't do seller sub-agency. There's transaction agency. Then there's buyers without an agent working with the seller's agent. All of these specific rules are really important to understand because they impact where the loyalties lie. Now, I said North Carolina does things better. We do, because several years ago, a form was created and is required to be given to the consumer. It's called Working with Real Estate Agents. In our lingo, we sometimes call it WWREA, which is not related to wrestling, just, WWREA, Working with Real Estate Agents. It is a form that by statute is to be given to the consumer at what we call first substantial contact, which means not just, hey, how are you in the produce area or on the phone, but the first time you start talking about the specifics of a property, where it sits, the cost, the financing, the vendor list, how everything works. If you're into the how everything works conversation, you shouldn't go there until somebody has seen WWREA. Now, the question that came in was from one of my fellow members of the profession here in North Carolina. Hey girl. And she wanted to know the best way to explain this form, because as you're already noticing, this feels really muddy and messy, and we just got started. So get a sip of something in the words of the immortal Bill Gallagher, and let's work together for a second. And I have to point out a great book to those of y'all that want to be better practitioners. It's called QBQ, The Question Behind the Question. I used this book in my Kicktail business planning session a couple of years ago. If you go back on YouTube, you can find those Kicktail sessions, and it's going to help you think through the best way to ask questions and how do you get to the heart of the matter. And that's the problem we have with agency right now. We have agents out there who know things in their head, but they're not super skilled at getting it out of their head to somebody else. And the other person can say, I got you. And that's what we want with the consumer public, is a great understanding of how this works and who's working for whom. The point of the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure is that everybody knows who works for whom and how the loyalties lie. And why this matters is because we're dealing with a compensation question right now about who pays who and how are they paid. And there's lots of logistical details in there and a lot of traditions in the business that came about for specific reasons. We just haven't really defined it super well. So that's what you're going to do here. Now, anytime you have a required form, you should use it. Let's just get that out of the way. Now, if you start to get in my comments and argue with me, please go talk to your own broker. I am the broker for several agents, but I am not your broker. So my answer to you, if you say, but what about this and but what about that, that's AYB, ask your broker. And if you're in North Carolina, it's a good reason to call Legal Hotline, which is one of your best benefits being a member of our North Carolina Realtors Trade Association. Now, that being said, this form is very simple on the surface. And the consumer needs to know who works for whom, because we see a lot of confusion when it comes to a human who sees a house and it's so cute and there's a sign in the yard. And by nature, we call the sign in the yard. And the agent picks up and says, hey, what's happening? And the buyer says, hey, I'm in front of the house on Elm Street. How much is it? And the listing agent says, oh, it's $439.9. Is that the price range you were thinking about? And the consumer says, yes, that sounds fine. Can we see it? And the listing agent says, well, come ahead on. I'll meet you over there. So what you're seeing happen here is questions that are being answered by somebody who just called a sign in the yard, doesn't know what's going on. All right, so that's not when you present Working with Real Estate Agents, because you haven't met them. You're answering some questions that are pretty easily discovered, frankly, using the interwebs, but we won't go there. And so the buyer shows up over here at the house and says, hey. Well, the agent at this moment, when they get there to the house, should immediately raise their hand and say, I want to be very clear that I work for the seller of this home. I am engaged by them with paperwork to be their exclusive listing agent. Do you have your own agent? That should be the very first thing happening. If you are the consumer and you have rolled up on that house and that agent just unlocked the door and let you on in and did not tell you who works for whom, that's when you should have Danger Will Robinson alarm bells going off before you walk in that house. And for the record, this also applies to new construction. The hostess with the mostest at that beautiful model home should immediately tell you, I work for the builder, I don't work for you. Because right now, the public seems to think that any real estate agent can work for them, and that's frankly just not how it works. You, as a member of the public, if you're buying a house in Concord, you should be having a conversation with me about who works for whom. And it should be very clear before you sign that register at that new construction neighborhood, before you sign anything with the agent who's listed the house. You should have some clarity. And that, friends, is what this working with real estate agents form is for. Now, some agents are very allergic to paperwork. And sometimes it's disorganization, and sometimes it's just fear. They're afraid that if they ask somebody to sign this, that person is going to say, I'm not signing anything, and run for the hills. Well, with most people, they will sign papers if you explain to them what it is they are signing in a clear and concise manner, which I know this is not concise, bear with me. So the working with real estate agents form defines who works for whom. There are agents who work for the sellers of properties. There are agents who work for the buyers of properties. There are agents who work for both parties in what's called dual agency. And then there's dual designated, which is those agents are inside the same company, but one's working for either party. And then there is seller sub-agency. It's not really explained much because it's very out of practice in North Carolina. And if you hear somebody talking about it, you should be very alert because that's going to involve vicarious liability, which I think is going to be a video for another time. And then there's this little blurb that says you can be the buyer who's unrepresented talking to the listing agent, but you're aware that they don't work for you. The reason we have that form is to make sure that before any conversations happen, you know that what you say can and will be used against you. Because it will. If you are the buyer of that house and you called about it and you walk up in that house and you say, here's our time frame, here's our money, here's all our story, and you don't have a relationship with that listing agent, you know what they can do? They can use it against you in that negotiation to benefit their seller who is their engaged party. That's what all this boils down to. You're supposed to know where the loyalties lie. The person whose sign is in the yard works for the seller in the discussion. If you are buying a house, your buyer agent should have a signed agreement with you that says, I'm working for you. We go in houses together. And when you don't have that signed agreement, then it's going to be very hard to prove that your best interests were looked after. That being said, North Carolina allows verbal buyer agency until you get all the way up to the point of contract. I personally think that is a pretty sloppy practice and that your buyers should know exactly what they get from an agent by signing that exclusive right to represent buyers. Now, back to that working with real estate agents form. I said you're supposed to see it at the first substantial contact. Now, some of y'all are watching this and thinking, Leigh Brown, I bought a house. I met with 6 different agents. I never saw that form until I bought my house. I feel you, friends. That's bad practice. You're supposed to see it at the first substantial contact. So let's say you're a real estate professional watching this and you're thinking, Leigh Brown, I don't present it myself until a little bit later in the process. All right, so fix your process. First substantial contact, which should be at the consultation. So you talk to them on the phone, y'all worked out a time to come see a property. How about before you go to that home, you go to a coffee shop or your office or some neutral third-party location with Wi-Fi and a well-lit parking lot and other humans so everybody's safe, and go over with them who works for whom and how it works at first substantial contact. Because a consumer needs to know before they walk in that property who works for whom. And y'all know people tell you way too much information. This is to protect the consumer and to protect the agent from information you maybe shouldn't be given unless you are in an engaged relationship. So when I'm sitting down with you, my buyer, I'm going to break out that form and it says WWREA, working with real estate agents. Here's the first thing I'm going to say. I'm going to guess that because you've met with other agents before you met me, I'm trying not to take it personally, but here we are. You've seen this multiple times, but you need to humor me and let me explain it so that I've done my job. And I know this is probably repetitive. Now, when I say that, y'all, most consumers look at me like, I haven't seen this. They're a little confused. because the consumer doesn't know the first substantial contact rule. So then I don't trash my competitors. I say, that's fine. Let me just go over it with you. This is my policy because I like to follow the state general statutes. And I explain that the person who signed us in the yard works for the seller. And if they engage me as their buyer agent, I can work for them as the buyer. And until they sign that paperwork, I'm deemed to actually be working for the seller unless we have some kind of agreement. Most people don't understand the intricacies of real estate because they watch Selling Sunset, and that ain't real estate. Or they watch HGTV, and that is seldom in North Carolina practice. So it's on you, the practitioner, to do a better job. And it's on you, the consumer, to know what that better job looks like. So that working with real estate agents form, it does not bind us together. It is not binding. It is not a contract. It is not an agency agreement. It is a disclosure of who works for whom. So when they sign it, all they are signing is that I gave it to them and did my level best to explain it. It's also, frankly, when I do explain to the consumer that I do not care for dual agency and I have seldom performed it in my professional life, simply because, as the Bible says, you cannot serve two masters. So I'm going to work for either the sellers or the buyers, but if my sellers have engaged a buyer, they found somebody, I'm going to connect that buyer to somebody else because I would prefer to work for one party. The form helps you explain that. Now, let's just say they're cool with it and they sign it. Well, now I've got it in my file. If you take a Cindy Chandler class or a Bill Gallagher class, it will say you got a file of flaps because it used to be a cardboard piece of paper. For those of y'all that are young folks who use PDF, when we talk about the flaps, we're talking about our old brochures because we're old people, but that's fine. So you've got a folder that's just full of these flaps because there are people that will sign the disclosure and they don't hire you as their agent, and that's okay. Because frankly, you should have one of these for every listing appointment you've been on, even if you didn't get the listing, and for every buyer you've worked with, even if you didn't get the buyer to engage with you. So now they've signed that form and they say, Leigh Brown, I like you very well. Please help me find a house in Harrisburg right near you. And I'll say, oh, hey, you should totally be my neighbors. That is when I transition to the exclusive right to represent buyer paperwork. I don't go to the buyer agency paperwork first. I explain agency and then I go to the exclusive right to represent buyer paperwork. And for those of y'all that want to know how to explain how buyer agency works, I've said it before and I'll say it again. This did not come from me. This came from my dad, Daryl Thomas, a very respected retired realtor, because yes, you can retire as a realtor, even as a realtor emeritus. And my dad said the best way to explain agency, as he learned it in the 90s when North Carolina got there first, whoop, whoop, is when you hire me as your agent, I can answer your questions with a paragraph instead of a sentence. And the sentence would be honesty, material facts, the things that by law we have to disclose. When I'm working for someone as their buyer agent, that paragraph is going to be all the other homework I do, the flood zones and the permits and the comps and all of the digging that a good agent does for their buyer clients. I don't owe all that homework to somebody who hasn't engaged me. I do owe them honesty and material facts. So as a professional, you should know exactly what your state statutes say. As a consumer, it's really great if you know what the statutes say, but if you don't, just know that you should always get a disclosure of agency before you walk through a door. You should know exactly if that professional in front of you is working for you or for someone else so that you can protect yourself. And then most importantly, keep your mouth shut until you know exactly who's on which side. It's very important that we don't expose ourselves to trouble. And as an agent, explain a lot of information faster, explain it earlier, and then get it in writing. Because the most important thing we can do is verify that we did our best to educate every consumer. Because if you didn't know it, that's what that pocket card means. When you are granted a real estate license from your state commission, this is any state, not just North Carolina, they have granted to you the public trust. Do you get what a big deal that is? When I say public trust, that state real estate commission that issued a license means that you have been entrusted with the best interest of every citizen of the state where you practice. For me, that's the best interest of every citizen of North Carolina, and because I am a South Carolina realtor as well, I'm entrusted with the best interest of every South Carolina consumer. Even in markets I don't serve, I'm trusted with their best interest. That's what the public trust looks like. So when you have these regulations that come down from your state, don't look at it as onerous. Look at it as a chance to elevate how you talk to people, when you talk to people, and how you explain it. And then when you get back to the question behind the question and you realize that you're doing a better job for consumer protection, it changes everything. So get better, get it in your file, and let me know if you have questions. I'll help any way I can.